Hello, I'm Antoine Vanner, the author of the Dawlish Chronicles series of naval adventures, and I'm talking to you in December 2025 in order to introduce you to the latest book in the series, the 13th, Britannia's Bluff. It's set in 1915, set in World War One. So what's the background? Well, in the course of the previous 12 books of the series, we've seen Nicholas Dawlish, the protagonist, going all the way from being a young boy of 13 in action for the first time in China in 1859. We've seen him move through his naval career up into the late 1880s, both in command of ships and naval forces, etc., and in clandestine operations. But we now jump forward to his later years. He's coming up to 70. He's been retired for 7 years. But when World War One begins in August 1914, he's called back to service and he's designated the commander of a new formation called, he's the chief of unconventional naval operations. What's happened in 1915? Well, it's a bad year for the Allies, for the British, the French, and the Russians. The euphoria of the early months of World War One has evaporated, and people are now finally realizing they're in for a very long haul, endless battle, and nobody can really see the end of it. In the course of 1915, the front has stabilized in the west between the English Channel and the Swiss border, and offensive by the French and the British to break through the German lines have proved costly failures. On the Eastern Front, it's even worse. There have been major victories by the Russians and Austro-Hungarians that have pushed the Russian forces back several hundred miles and inflicted absolutely massive losses. The Russians are badly resourced for armaments, for munitions, and for other warlike supplies. And getting them to them is difficult because the only realistic route available is through the White Sea and the port of Murmansk, north of the Arctic Circle. And there's very little linkage between there and the Russian fronts. What seems like a very good solution on paper is to actually force a route through from the Mediterranean, from the Aegean Sea, through the Dardanelles and Bosporus Straits into the Black Sea to supply the Russians through ports such as Odessa, Sevastopol, Novorossiysk, etc. There's one problem there. That is that Turkey is Germany's ally. And the Turks have very heavily fortified the Dardanelles Strait, which is very, very narrow in places. It's 45 miles long, but in places comes down to half a mile wide. And there are minefields as well. And an initial attempt to drive through with a massive force of battleships has proved to be a very, very costly failure. So there's always a great military adage that says, don't reinforce failure. But this is what the Allies do. They then decide that the way around it is to land forces on Gallipoli itself. Gallipoli is the very rocky, very rugged peninsula that lies on the western side of the Dardanelles Strait, and to try to capture the Turkish fortifications from inland. This is a massive failure. The forces that are landed, British, Irish, Australian, New Zealand, the Anzacs, and the French, secure only very, very small footholds on the coast, and at no point are they more than about 2 miles from the front line. The Turks are heavily entrenched on the heights above them, and the beaches on which the Allies have landed and through which they must be supplied are dominated by Turkish artillery. So a large number of offences right through the summer of 1915 have done nothing to advance the lines significantly, and the losses have been absolutely horrendous. not just from the battle itself, but from disease on an epic scale. By November 1915, the decision has got to be taken. Are we going to hang on in Gallipoli, or are we going to pull out? And since defeat is staring them in the face, it's obvious that there's going to be no success there. The alternative is evacuation. There are over 80,000 men on the peninsula, and they've got to be taken off these beaches that are under fire from Turkish artillery and menaced by Turkish machine guns. Nothing like this has been attempted in history before on this scale, and the evacuation promises to be just as much a disaster as the entire operation to date. So where does Dawlish come in? Well, he has an idea as how he might actually lessen the risks associated with this. And this involves a massive bluff, a diversion, which will run in parallel with the efforts to evacuate, but which will demand surprise, speed, daring, and a very, very high degree of deception. Resources are scarce. The new armies that are being created by Britain, by Lord Kitchener, are still really not come into the field as yet. Manpower is scarce. So it's going to be difficult to pull together the necessary forces for participating on this land. Much the same applies according to the shipping he's going to need. Ships are at a premium, and he's going to make a lot of use out of obsolete or obsolescent units. But he does have one ace up his sleeve, and that is that technology is going to help. Because in the last decade before this, radio has appeared, and so have aircraft. And one of the great achievements of the Royal Navy in World War I was the creation of the Royal Navy Air Service, which invented aerial warfare at sea as we've known it ever since. They've even created the first very primitive aircraft carriers, capable of carrying float planes, seaplanes. So those are going to be certainly a help on the way. So this campaign he's going to launch, which will be a matter of just a few weeks only to resource and to implement and to get the hell back out of it again, because it's essentially what used to be called by the Victorians a butcher and bolt affair, where you go in, do the maximum damage you can, and get the hell back out of it again. This is a butcher and bolt affair. He's only got a few weeks for it, and he's dependent upon quite a number of enterprising young men, young officers, young NCOs, etc., to make this happen. It's going to be a campaign that's fought on land, sea, and air. Now, for him as well, he's an older man now, and he's looking back upon some of the aspects of his career are weighing quite heavily on him. It's got significant personal interest for him, personal significance, because those of you who have read Britannia's Wolf, the novel set in 1877, when Dawlish first meets his wonderful wife, he meets her off in the Dardanelles. He meets her on a boat, passing through the Dardanelles, passing the ruins of Troy on a misty morning in October 1877. And from there on, the great love affair of their lives begins. So that's for him, it's significant. That memory is very, very, very powerful. But on top of that, in those years, 1877, 78, he was on secondment to the Turkish Navy, fighting the Russians. And he retained a very, very great affection for the Turkish fighting men and the Turkish fighting man, and for the Turks as a nation, although he despised the rulers, not just in that period, the vicious sultan of the time, but also the now Turkey is under an even worse tyranny. In 1915 is ruled by a military triumvirate of three totally evil men who were also at the same time busy implementing the Armenian genocide. On top of that, something is weighing quite heavily on him, as was weighing on a lot of other senior officers at the time. It was the awareness that men of their generation had created the world, had created the disaster that had engulfed Europe and which was consuming vast numbers of young lives. It's hit Victoria's own family. His beloved sister's grandson has already been killed in Flanders earlier that year. And many of his friends are losing sons, grandsons as well. So he's very determined in the course of this campaign of hoping to minimize losses during evacuation and hoping to buy time and buy a future and buy the promise of fulfillment for young men in the course of this. So he carries the burden of command very heavily in this book. But the action is very heavily driven as well by enterprising younger people, including not least his own half-brother, Edgar, Ted, who is some 30 years younger, and who is himself now a commander in the Royal Naval Air Service. There's a strong political aspect to it as well, because when he has got to deal with the situation on the ground once he is waging this campaign, and he has got to interface with Ottoman authorities or Turkish authorities in the area he's occupying. And that draws heavily upon the experience that he had in his earlier years as essentially a commissioned officer in the Ottoman Navy. There's also a role to be played by a certain Oxford academic, an archaeologist, who's going to prove very useful to him in relation to this. So quite a fast-moving story, action at sea, action on land, action in the air, and a high degree of dash, imagination, initiative, daring, and deceit. So I hope you'll enjoy it. I hope it's a rattling good story. So there it is. Britannia's Bluff. Got to get the sun reflections on it. Britannia's Bluff, November 1915 to January 1916. And I hope you'll enjoy it. Best wishes, good luck, Antoine Vanner.